You're a relic, Simon. North Star has outgrown whatever you think you are.
Thank you. You just fired the only person who holds the key to the empire you are about to lose.
The first thing I heard was my own name being spoken like a clerical error. Effective immediately, Carter Hale announced, barely lifting his eyes from the paper. Simon Brooks is terminated. No build-up. No explanation, just that flat, mechanical tone people use when they read the weather report. For a second, I wondered if he even understood the weight of what he was saying, or if he was simply proud he managed to pronounce my name correctly on the first try. Then again, moments like that have a way of revealing who's really watching. Before I go on, where are you listening from right now, I ask, because this channel isn't for everyone. Most people come for drama. But you, if you're still here, it means you're looking for something deeper than shock, something real. And if that's true, you belong here. Subscribe now, stay ahead of the story, not behind it. Now, back to what happened next. The boardroom froze around me. 12 executives, all suddenly fascinated by their polished notebooks, pretended they hadn't just watched a 55-year-old man get erased in under 10 seconds. I felt the shock first sharp and metallic, then the familiar cold settled in behind it, the kind that spreads through your chest before your brain can catch up. After 12 years holding North Star Freight Technologies together through 3 supply chain collapses, this was how it ended, one board sentence from a 38-year-old CEO who still practiced decisive leadership poses in bathroom mirrors. I didn't move at first. Carter clearly expected outrage, maybe a raised voice, maybe a desperate plea to keep the job I had practically soldered together with my own hands. But I wasn't going to give him that performance. Slowly, deliberately. I picked up the pen I had brought to the meeting, clicked it once, and stood. A thin, almost amused smile formed before I could stop it. I could feel every pair of eyes dart toward me, waiting for the breakdown that would make their morning more interesting. Instead, I simply said 2 words: quiet, steady, unbearably calm. Thank you. The temperature in the room shifted. Confusion flickered across faces like a bad signal. Carter blinked twice, as if trying to decode whether I was agreeing with him or threatening him. They all assumed those 2 words meant surrender. They couldn't have been more wrong. As I walked out, the silence followed, thick, sticky, clinging to my shoulders. But beneath that silence, I felt something else stirring, not defeat, not fear, just the faint, steady rumble of an earthquake no one in that room saw coming. I didn't start the engine right away, after walking out of that boardroom. I sat in my car with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard as if it could tell me what to do next. The humiliation was still fresh, clinging to my skin like a cold fog. 12 years. 12 years building the logistics architecture that kept North Star Freight Technologies afloat through 3 national shipping crises, and I was dismissed as if my entire career were nothing more than a clerical adjustment. The weight of that reality pressed into my ribs, and for a moment, I felt hollow, stripped of something I didn't know could be taken away so easily. Eventually, my phone vibrated. Then again, then again. The notifications rolled across the screen like a silent emergency alarm. Messages from my engineering team, people I had mentored, fought for, defended in meetings where their names were never even mentioned. Their words were frantic, sharp around the edges. Are we still allowed to deploy? HR isn't giving us direction. Do we stop? Do we continue? What happens now? Each message twisted the knife a little deeper. They weren't just confused, they were scared. And I wasn't there anymore to absorb the blow for them. That thought stung more than the firing itself. I had always been the one standing between them and the chaos above. Now they were sending distress signals into a void. I set the phone down, closed my eyes, and let the guilt settle. It felt like I'd abandoned them on a battlefield I'd trained them to survive, only to watch them fend for themselves. Maybe I had failed. Maybe Carter had been right when he implied the company needed younger leadership. Maybe I had become the outdated part in a machine I once built. Then, another message appeared, short, almost careless. It was from Evan, the youngest intern on our team. He had joined only 4 months earlier, all nervous energy and stubborn curiosity. His text read, "They don't know who owns the routing platform rights, do they?" I froze. My pulse kicked in my ears as the meaning sank in. Evan, of all people, had seen it. The directors hadn't. Carter certainly hadn't. But this 20-year-old intern had connected a thread no one else noticed. He was right. The platform at the heart of North Star, the routing logic that governed federal freight lanes, wasn't registered under the company. 3 years ago, during a round of devastating budget cuts, I had quietly funneled the intellectual property into a separate holding entity I created to protect it from being gutted. North Star didn't own it. I did. And as that realization settled, something inside me shifted. The hollow ache didn't disappear, but it cracked just enough for a faint, steady ember of confidence to glow through the darkness. The story wasn't over, not even close. Don't comment yet. The next paragraph will make you change your mind. I drove home without turning on the radio, letting the silence press in around me. By the time I stepped into my apartment, the weight of the day settled across my shoulders like a soaked blanket. The place looked even smaller than usual, boxes stacked along the walls, folders spilling across the dining table, half-finished logistics models taped to the refrigerator. For years, this cramped apartment had been my quiet refuge after long nights at North Star. Tonight, it felt like a storage closet where a forgotten life had been shoved aside. The loneliness hit harder than I expected, sharp enough to make me stand still for a moment before I even closed the door. But eventually, habit took over. I dropped my keys onto the counter, rolled up my sleeves, and sat at the table, surrounded by the relics of battles fought and won, budget drafts, routing diagrams, fallback strategies from crisis years. If North Star had truly cast me out, then I needed to understand exactly what I still held in my hands. So I pulled the first box closer, then another, until the table was buried in paper. Hours slipped by. I moved from contract to contract, flipping pages that smelled faintly of dust and old toner. I reread memos written during nights when the company was bleeding money, when entire departments feared layoffs, when I had worked alone to keep the routing platform alive. I remembered the exhaustion, the fear, the desperate determination to protect the system before executives dismantled it out of ignorance. That memory tightened my chest, and for a moment, I felt myself sinking, isolated, discarded, a man who had given too much for too long. And then, sometime after midnight, something shifted. I opened a yellow folder I barely recognized, a relic from the worst budget cut North Star had ever imposed. Inside was a copy of the legal restructuring packet, the one I had drafted in a haze of coffee, panic, and sheer stubbornness. Most of it was routine, nothing I hadn't seen 100 times. But halfway down the third page, a line caught the corner of my vision, a sentence highlighted faintly in a color almost faded away. I leaned closer under the desk lamp. In the event of project termination or replacement of the chief architect, all operational rights revert temporarily to the original architect until full reintegration. My breath stopped. I read it again, and once more to make sure fatigue wasn't twisting the words. But it was there, clear, legal, enforceable. A clause I had written to protect the system from reckless leadership. A clause no one else had bothered to read. A clause Carter himself had triggered by firing me. The realization sparked through me like a live wire. The loneliness didn't disappear, but it cracked open, replaced by something steadier, something fierce. I straightened in my seat, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers. My apartment no longer felt like a cell. It felt like a control room. And for the first time since walking out of North Star, I wasn't sinking, I was rising. 9 days passed, not quickly, not slowly, but with the steady rhythm of a man waiting for a storm he knew was coming. After finding that clause in my apartment, everything inside me settled into a colder, clearer place. I didn't reach out to North Star. I didn't warn anyone. I simply watched, from a quiet distance, as the clock ticked toward the moment when the company would finally meet the consequences of its own ignorance. That moment arrived on a Tuesday morning. North Star had been hyping a major demonstration of its fully optimized autonomous freight network, a pitch meant to assure investors that everything was under control. Dozens of them flew in, packed into the company's glossy auditorium with coffees in hand and expectations high. Carter, in his tailored suit and trademark smirk, walked on stage like a man who believed the universe still worked in his favor. I wasn't there. Of course, I was home, sitting at my small kitchen table, a cup of Earl Grey warming my hands. I opened my laptop, not to access the system I didn't need to, but to watch the internal Slack channel my old team still hadn't removed me from. The updates arrived in real time. when the demo began. The first thing on the giant screen was supposed to be a live routing map. Instead, the display flickered once, then dimmed to gray. A single line of text appeared across the center in sterile white letters: "Routing authorization expired." I stared at the screen capture someone posted, feeling a slow, controlled satisfaction settle in my chest. Not joy, not revenge, just the clean, cold confirmation that the system was behaving exactly as it was built to. They had cut out the architect, and the architecture had responded. Carter, according to the whispers filling the Slack channel, tried to laugh it off, murmuring something about a quick refresh and waving at the engineers in the back of the room. But 2 minutes became 10, 10 became 20, and the message never changed. The authorization they needed no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. My phone buzzed. It was Logan. "Ops can't access staging. They're sweating." I took a sip of tea, letting the steam curl toward my face. Another message appeared from Priya, a single emoji, the lock. The perfect summary. Meanwhile, inside the auditorium, tension thickened until someone finally snapped. A director stood up and shouted over the murmurs, "Are we saying we've actually lost control of the routing network?" That question echoed through the Slack channel like a siren. Their empire so polished, so confident, had just grown its first visible crack. A crack large enough for every investor in that room to see. A crack Carter couldn't patch with charm or buzzwords. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the soft hum of my apartment. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't angry. I was simply resolute. North Star had made its choice. Now it was starting to feel its consequences. This paragraph explains everything you're about to hear. The morning after the failed demo. I woke earlier than usual, the quietness of my apartment settling around me like a familiar cloak. There was no rush, no deadline, no frantic schedule to maintain. North Star had removed me from all of that. Yet for the first time since being fired, I felt strangely balanced. Maybe it was the clarity that comes when you finally see a system, corporate or otherwise, for what it truly is. Maybe it was the knowledge that the routing platform was locked behind a door only I could open, whatever the reason. I brewed my coffee with a steadiness I hadn't felt in days. That peace lasted exactly 7 minutes. My phone rang, lighting up with a number I recognized all too well. North Star's Human Resources. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out of pure principle, but curiosity nudged harder, and I answered. "Simon." The voice burst through the speaker with forced brightness, the kind that tastes like artificial sweetener. "We've been worried about you." Worried? I almost laughed. Where was that concern when Carter announced my termination as if he were canceling a magazine subscription? But I kept my tone neutral, letting her fill the silence with her own discomfort. "I'm fine," I said. "Oh, that's wonderful to hear." She rushed out. "Listen, the last few days have been challenging. Leadership has been reviewing the situation, and we feel it would be mutually beneficial if you returned, just temporarily. Of course, for stability." There it was, the word they always run to when they're panicking. Stability. What they meant was, we're drowning, and you're the only one who knows how to swim. I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze drift across the scattered papers of my apartment turned command center. I could almost hear the chaos from their offices, the scrambling executives, the glitching dashboards, the sudden realization that the architect they dismissed now controlled the architecture. And naturally, she continued, "We're open to discussing compensation adjustments, whatever seems fair for your expertise, this time." I did smile, not broadly, just enough to feel the edges of it. "You don't have enough money," I said softly. Silence. A sharp, brittle kind. I'm sorry," she stammered. "You heard me. You don't have enough money to buy back the truth, the sleepless nights, the crisis years, the platform you never understood, the one you tried to bury under new leadership, and most importantly, you don't have enough to purchase my silence." Another silence followed, longer, heavier. It carried all the fear they'd tried so hard to mask. For the first time since that boardroom humiliation, the balance of power was unmistakable. They'd fired me thinking they were cutting away dead weight. Instead, they'd handed me the leverage to bring the entire company to its knees, and they were only just beginning to realize it. The call with HR echoed in my mind long after it ended, not because it unsettled me, but because it confirmed something I had quietly suspected. North Star wasn't just unstable, they were desperate. That desperation had a way of attracting attention. And sure enough, the next morning my inbox lit up with a message from a name I hadn't seen in years: Iron Rail Dynamics. If North Star was the backbone of federal freight routing, Iron Rail was the muscle challenging them at every turn. They were fierce competitors, relentless, and never charitable. So when I opened the email, caution rose instinctively in my chest. The invitation was short, almost too neatly worded, and signed by someone who made me straighten in my chair: Caleb Dalton. I hadn't spoken to Caleb since the day Carter publicly dismissed him for being disruptive, which was Carter's polite way of saying Caleb told the truth too often for anyone's comfort. Caleb had been one of the sharpest engineers on our team, equal parts brilliant and blunt. If he was reaching out now, it wasn't by accident. Curiosity nudged me forward. We agreed to meet at a small cafe tucked between two old brick buildings downtown, the sort of place where nobody rushed, and nobody cared enough to listen. When I walked in, Caleb was already there, leaning back in his chair with that same lopsided grin he used to wear when he'd figured out something the rest of us hadn't. "Simon Brooks," he said, tapping the table. "Didn't think I'd see the day you were on the outside." "Life is full of surprises," I replied carefully. He chuckled. "More than you know." Then he slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was a document I recognized immediately: the operational licensing contract for North Star's federal routing platform. But this version wasn't marked with internal stamps or draft labels. It was clean, organized and highlighted. Carter never read it. Caleb said, not past the summary page, but Iron Rail did. My eyes scanned the yellow marking across the lower half of the third section, Clause 7.2. One only the original architect may authorize, reactivate, or transfer functional control of the federal routing network. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression still. "You knew?" I asked quietly. "Oh, we knew," Caleb answered. "North Star didn't. Investors didn't. Carter sure as hell didn't. But we've been watching the cracks grow since they fired you." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "So tell me, Simon, do you want that system running for people who didn't value it or for a company that might actually deserve it?" His question hung between us like a loaded switch. For the first time since everything collapsed, the next move wasn't forced on me. It belonged to me. For the rest of the week, I moved through my days with the calm patience of someone who already knew how the story would unfold. When you've built a system from the ground up, you understand its pulse, its rhythms, its limits, and more importantly, you recognize when someone is faking mastery over it. So when Carter pushed a headline into the press announcing, "North Star's routing platform fully restored," I didn't even bother to raise an eyebrow. I simply closed the article, set my phone down, and waited. The system wasn't restored. It couldn't be. Not without me. And deep down, Carter had to know that. But fear makes men perform. And he had an entire board to convince that his leadership hadn't just detonated the company's most valuable asset. So he gave them a show, an empty one. The first hints of trouble came the following morning. Small at first. A minor delay in the Midwest lane refresh, a timeout on the Gulf Coast line. Nothing catastrophic, nothing public, but enough for anyone truly watching to see the cracks forming. I kept an eye on the internal chat thread my old team still forgot to remove me from. Their messages told the real story. Staging won't sync. Is this part of the hotfix Carter wants a statement drafted? Something about transient latency? Are we actually stable or pretending we're stable by then? The answer was obvious. And yet, I didn't gloat, I didn't interfere. I simply observed, quiet, steady, patient. Then came the collapse. It happened exactly 24 hours after Carter's triumphant press release. At 9:17 in the morning, the entire routing dashboard blinked out across every North Star terminal. Screens went from active maps to a flat, expressionless gray. Then, the same 6 words appeared in every region, every hub, every executive tablet routing authorization expired. Again, this time. There was no auditorium applause to drown the panic, no crowd to buffer the humiliation. It hit them raw. Within minutes, Slack was a blaze of frantic updates. Someone posted a video clip of the operations floor phones ringing nonstop, managers pacing like trapped animals, analysts tapping keys hard enough to break them. Customers called demanding explanations. Clients threatened breach penalties. Investors began dumping shares faster than North Star's legal department could draft excuses, and somewhere inside the headquarters, A director finally snapped. I didn't see it in person, but the retelling was vivid. The man slammed his palm against the conference table and shouted, "The thing you called a restoration, was it just a hollow demo script?" The room reportedly went silent. Carter, the same man who strutted through hallways with polished certainty, went pale, completely pale. Words failed him. The illusion he'd been clinging to finally crumbled in front of people powerful enough to end him with a vote. Meanwhile, I sat in my small apartment, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the chaos unfold through messages and whispers, not triumphant, not vindictive, just patient like a watchmaker observing gears finally locking into the place they were always meant to fall. The fake fix had collapsed. The real reckoning had begun. By the time North Star finally called me in, the collapse had spread far enough that even the board couldn't pretend things were stabilizing. Their message arrived before sunrise, urgent, formal, and dripping with the kind of politeness corporations reserve for situations that terrify them. I read it once, closed my phone, and finished my breakfast. Panic wasn't contagious when you'd already lived through the worst of it. 2 hours later, I walked through North Star's glass doors with the calm certainty of a man who knew exactly where every crack in the foundation now lay. Employees watched as I passed, some curious, some relieved, some visibly shaken. Word travels fast in buildings held together by fear. But I didn't stop. I wasn't here for sympathy. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here to reclaim what was mine. The boardroom looked the same as the day Carter fired me, yet everything felt different. The tension was thick enough to taste. Half the directors sat stiffly in their seats. The other half whispered to one another until they noticed me enter. Carter hovered near the corner like a man bracing for impact. His suit rumpled for the first time since I'd known him. "Simon," the chairman began, gesturing stiffly. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." I pulled out a chair slowly, deliberately. "Let's be clear before we start," I said, my voice level. "I'm not here to negotiate my return." A ripple of confusion swept through the room. "I'm not reopening the routing platform." I continued. "And I'm not stepping back into North Star." I paused, letting each word land with precision. "I'm here to inform you that I will be selling the digital asset, my asset, outright." Silence snapped across the table like a cable under strain. A director dropped his pen. Another inhaled sharply, as if the air had suddenly thinned. Then Carter exploded. "You can't do that," he yelled, stepping forward with a mix of rage and desperation. "You don't have the authority. North Star owns." I cut him off by placing a thick folder on the center of the table. The stack of documents landed with a solid, final thud. "Everything you're about to argue," I said quietly, "is disproven right here." The chairman reached for the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were the contracts, the restructuring notes, the emergency clauses drafted during the budget collapse, and the signature-bearing approvals that had kept the platform alive. Every line, every stamp, every overlooked detail pointed to the same truth. The routing platform reverted to me the moment Carter terminated my position. One director murmured, "How did we miss this?" "You didn't read it," I answered. "You trusted someone who didn't understand the system he tried to control." Carter's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time since he fired me, the power dynamic flipped in absolute silence. I leaned back in my chair, steady and unshaken. "I'm not asking for permission," I said. "I'm informing you of the outcome." 2 days after the board meeting, I found myself standing in the marble lobby of Iron Rail Dynamics, a place I'd only ever heard about in competitive analyses and whispered conference gossip. The building smelled of fresh paint, ambition, and money that moved without hesitation. Unlike North Star's sterile corridors, Iron Rail felt alive, as if every conversation and every keystroke carried purpose instead of panic. For the first time in weeks, I felt the air in my lungs stretch without resistance. Caleb was waiting for me near the elevator bank, leaning casually against a column just as he had leaned against server racks years ago. "You ready?" he asked, his grin half mocking, half approving. "Ready enough," I replied. Though the truth was something deeper, a quiet, rising sense of freedom I hadn't felt since before Carter walked into my life. He led me to a glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor. Inside, 2 executives were already seated, folders neatly arranged, expressions politely confident. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to win. After brief formalities, one of them slid a document toward me. Mr. Brooks, Iron Rail Dynamics is prepared to acquire the North Star Federal Routing Platform for a total of $1.1 billion. There it was, printed in clean numbers that almost felt unreal. $1.1 billion. Enough to erase any doubt about the value of what I had built, enough to rewrite my future several times over. But as the offer hung in the air, I felt a strange calm settle in. Money wasn't the question. Legacy was. I'll consider it, I said. On one condition. Caleb's eyebrows lifted slightly. The executives leaned in. I won't be your employee, I continued. I won't be your figurehead, either. If you want the system, I want oversight. I want to serve as chief advisory architect, independent, autonomous, and with authority over how the platform is implemented. If my technology is going to power the country's freight lanes, then I'm going to make sure it's used correctly. Silence settled for a moment, not resistance calculation. Then one of the executives nodded slowly. We can agree to that. Caleb smirked, as if he'd known from the start that I wouldn't sign without carving space for my principles. Seems fair, he added. The final contract placed both the number and my new title in unmistakable ink. When I picked up the pen, the weight of everything, the humiliation, the firing, the collapse, the truth they never read gathered behind the stroke of a signature that would reshape the very industry North Star once dominated. When it was done, I didn't feel richer. I felt restored. I hadn't reclaimed my worth with a paycheck. I'd reclaimed it with the power to decide the future of the technology I created and the freedom to walk into that future on my own terms. 14 days after the morning Carter fired me, North Star collapsed with the kind of violent precision only arrogance can trigger. The stock didn't dip, it plunged, straight down like a steel beam cut loose from a crane. Clients terminated contracts in batches, partners withdrew overnight, and federal agencies issued statements filled with phrases like reviewing compliance concerns. Every headline carried a similar tune: North Star Freight Technologies in freefall. Watching it unfold felt surreal, almost cinematic. I wasn't celebrating, but there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the truth do what I never needed to. Justice rarely arrives with applause, it arrives with consequences, and North Star was now drowning in all of them. The board moved quickly, desperate to salvage whatever scraps remained. Carter was their first offering to the public. They shoved him in front of cameras at a hastily assembled press conference, as if sacrificing him might calm the storm. I watched the live stream from Iron Rail's office. His face was chalk white, his tie hung crooked as though he'd dressed while running. Reporters shouted at him, flashing questions like weapons. For once, the man who always rehearsed his charisma had nothing left to perform. The silence between each answer was louder than the downfall itself. Then came my turn. Iron Rail held its own press event on the same afternoon, this one crisp, polished, and unmistakably confident. When I stepped up to the podium, the room lit up with cameras, not hostile, not hungry, curious, respectful, the kind of attention no one in North Star's boardroom had ever offered me. The contract for the acquisition, the billion-dollar agreement that sealed North Star's fate, lay waiting on the table beside me. Reporters leaned in. Flashes exploded. Questions layered over one another in rising waves. But I wasn't there to explain the past. I was there to claim the future. I lifted the pen slowly, letting the moment breathe. Every step that brought me here, the firing, the humiliation, the silence, the rediscovery of my own work compressed into the weight of that signature. And when the final stroke dried on the page, applause erupted so fast the microphones crackled. Only then did I speak. Thank you. 2 simple words, delivered with calm finality. Not gratitude for the firing, not forgiveness. No, the thank you was for something far cleaner and far sharper. They had given me everything. Power, freedom, ownership, legacy. All because they never bothered to understand the man they tried to discard. As I stepped back from the podium, the flashes continued, but the noise faded. What remained was clarity, quiet, steady, undeniable. North Star had fallen, and I had finally risen into the life they accidentally built for me. When the cameras faded and I finally stepped away, I realized my biggest victory wasn't the contract, it was remembering my own worth. If this story reminded you that dignity can outlast destruction, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment, tap like. Share this with someone who needs a spark, and subscribe if you want more stories that hit deeper than drama. Your voice keeps this journey alive.